The morning sun barely touched the tall windows of the Riverside Music Conservatory when Daniel Hayes pushed through the heavy oak doors. His sneakers made soft squeaking sounds on the marble floor, and he kept his eyes down, hoping nobody would notice him. The backpack on his shoulders was old and faded, held together with duct tape at the corners. Inside were his notebooks, a half-eaten sandwich from yesterday, and the most precious thing he owned, a collection of sheet music his grandmother had given him before she passed away. Daniel was 19 years old, thin and nervous with calloused fingers that told the story of countless hours spent on piano keys. He had received a scholarship to study at this prestigious conservatory, a place where the children of diplomats and business tycoons learned to perfect their craft. Everything here spoke of money and tradition. The paintings on the walls were originals. The instruments were worth more than his mother's annual salary. Even the other students seemed to shine with a confidence that came from never worrying about next month's rent. He made his way toward the grand auditorium where the orchestra was already rehearsing. Through the doors he could hear the rich sound of violins warming up, the deep voice of cellos, the bright notes of flutes dancing above it all. His heart hammered in his chest. Today was supposed to be his first day as the understudy pianist for the upcoming international competition. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, something he had dreamed about since he was a little boy playing on his grandmother's broken keyboard. The auditorium was massive, with red velvet seats rising in rows toward a painted ceiling that showed angels playing instruments among the clouds. On stage, the orchestra sat in a semicircle, and at the center of it all stood Maestro Antonio Ricci, a legend in the classical music world. The maestro was a short man with gray hair swept back from his forehead, a carefully trimmed beard, and eyes that could freeze you with a single glance. He wore an expensive suit and moved with the authority of someone who had conducted in every major concert hall from Vienna to Tokyo. Daniel stood at the side entrance, waiting for the right moment to approach. The orchestra was in the middle of a complex piece, and the maestro's hands moved through the air like he was painting invisible pictures. His baton sliced through space with precision, demanding perfection from every musician before him. When the piece ended, the maestro lowered his arms and turned to grab his water bottle. That was when he spotted Daniel near the stage steps. The boy was moving toward the beautiful Steinway grand piano that sat like a black jewel under the spotlight. "Stop!" The maestro's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Don't touch my piano, poor guy." The words echoed in the vast space. Every head in the orchestra turned to look. Daniel froze, his hand halfway extended toward the piano bench. His face burned with embarrassment. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, could hear the whispers starting among the musicians. I'm Daniel Hayes," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm the new understudy pianist. The office told me to report here today." The maestro walked toward him slowly, his shoes clicking on the stage floor. He looked Daniel up and down, taking in the cheap sneakers, the worn jeans, the backpack with its torn straps. His lip curled slightly. Not quite a sneer, but close enough. "Understudy," the maestro repeated, making the word sound like an insult. Yes, I was informed. But you don't just walk in here and put your hands on a $300,000 instrument like it's some toy in a music shop. This piano is my responsibility. Do you understand what that means?" "I'm sorry, sir. I just thought you thought wrong." The maestro waved his hand dismissively. "You scholarship students, you think because they give you a free ride, you can just blend in with real musicians. But it doesn't work that way. Talent isn't enough. You need refinement, culture, background." From the orchestra, Daniel heard a few muffled laughs. A blonde girl in the violin section whispered something to her neighbor, and they both smirked. The principal pianist, a young man named Christopher Bennett, who came from a family of famous musicians, sat with his arms crossed, looking at Daniel like he was a stain on the carpet. "Go sit in the back," the maestro said, already turning away. "Watch and learn. Maybe in a few weeks, if you prove yourself capable, we'll consider letting you touch the practice pianos. But my Steinway, that's for serious musicians only." Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. He wanted to argue, to explain that he had been playing piano since he was 5 years old, that his grandmother had taught him on an old upright with 3 broken keys, that music was the only thing that made sense to him in a world that often felt cruel and confusing. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded silently and walked to the back row of seats, sinking into the shadows. As the rehearsal continued, Daniel sat alone, clutching his backpack on his lap. He watched Christopher play the piano parts, technically perfect but somehow cold, like someone reading words from a page without understanding what they meant. The maestro praised every phrase, calling Christopher brilliant and a natural genius. Daniel's mind drifted to his grandmother. She had died 2 years ago, but he could still hear her voice clearly. She used to tell him stories about when she was young, singing in small clubs and bars, making just enough money to survive. She never became famous, never played in fancy concert halls, but she understood music in a way that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. "Baby," she would tell him while he practiced on her battered keyboard, "music doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It doesn't care what kind of piano you play or what address you put on your letters. Music only cares about what's in your heart. You remember that when people try to make you feel small." He remembered the last time he saw her, thin and weak in a hospital bed that smelled of disinfectant and sadness. She had pressed her collection of sheet music into his hands. Some of the pages were yellow with age, covered in pencil marks and notes she had written over the years. "Promise me you'll keep playing," she had whispered. "Promise me you won't let anyone steal your music." He had promised. And he meant to keep that promise no matter how many maestros looked at him like he didn't belong. The rehearsal ended, and the orchestra members packed up their instruments, chatting and laughing among themselves. Nobody spoke to Daniel. He might as well have been invisible. As he stood to leave, he took one last look at the Steinway grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights like dark water. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and the hurt, a small flame of determination flickered to life. They might not let him touch that piano now, but somehow, someday he would prove that his grandmother was right. Music didn't care about money or status or what anyone called you. Music only cared about what was in your heart. And Daniel's heart was full of music. 3 weeks had passed since that horrible first day, and Daniel had developed a routine that nobody at the conservatory knew about. Every morning at 5 o'clock, while the city was still dark and quiet, he would slip through the side entrance of the building using his student access card. The hallways were empty at that hour, lit only by the dim emergency lights that cast long shadows on the walls. He moved like a ghost through those corridors, his footsteps silent, his breathing careful, past the administrative offices with their locked doors, past the practice rooms where students would later argue over time slots, past the photographs of famous alumni who stared down from their frames with proud, accomplished faces, and finally to the grand auditorium where the Steinway piano waited in the darkness like a sleeping giant. The first time he had touched those keys in secret, his hands had trembled so badly he could barely play a scale. What if someone heard? What if the maestro found out? What if they expelled him for breaking the rules? But the moment his fingers pressed down and the first note sang out into the empty hall, all those fears melted away. The piano had a voice unlike anything he had ever played before, rich and deep and singing with possibilities. Now 3 weeks later, his morning sessions had become the most important part of his day. While the conservatory slept, Daniel explored every corner of his musical ability. He played the classical pieces he was supposed to be learning, but he also played other things. Jazz riffs his grandmother had taught him, blues progressions that spoke of pain and hope. He mixed them together, letting his instincts guide his fingers, creating something that wasn't quite classical and wasn't quite jazz, but somehow felt true. During regular hours, nothing had changed. The maestro still ignored him during rehearsals. Christopher still played the piano parts while Daniel sat in the back, watching and learning but never touching. The other students still avoided him like he carried some disease that poverty might be contagious. But Daniel didn't care anymore. He had his secret morning hours, and that was enough. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 4 days after his first humiliation, something unexpected happened. Daniel was in the middle of playing a complicated piece, his eyes closed, completely lost in the music, when he heard a sound behind him. A door closing softly. His hands froze on the keys. His heart jumped into his throat. "Don't stop on my account," said a voice with a gentle accent. Daniel spun around on the piano bench. Standing in the aisle between the seats was an older man in a gray maintenance uniform, holding a mop and a bucket. He had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and his face showed the lines of someone who had lived a long and complicated life. Daniel recognized him as one of the janitors, though they had never spoken before. I'm sorry," Daniel stammered. I know I'm not supposed to be here this early. I know the maestro said not to touch his piano. Please don't report me. I'll leave right now." The janitor shook his head and walked down the aisle toward the stage. "My name is Thomas Chen. I've been working here for 15 years, and in all that time I've never heard anyone play like you just did." Daniel didn't know what to say. He waited for the lecture, the warning, the threat of consequences. Instead, Thomas smiled and set down his bucket. "I come in early to clean before the students arrive. I've been hearing you play for the past 3 weeks. Every morning I unlock this auditorium door for my cleaning rounds, and there you are." At first I thought about saying something, but then I listened, really listened, and I realized something special was happening. "You're not going to tell anyone?" Daniel asked carefully. "Why would I do that?" Thomas pulled up a chair and sat down in the front row. "You're not hurting anything. You're just practicing. That piano needs to be played, needs to breathe. Instruments are like people. They get sad when they're locked away and only used for show." Over the next hour, as the sky outside began to lighten from black to deep blue, Thomas told Daniel his story. He had grown up in Beijing, the son of music teachers. As a young man, he had dreamed of becoming a professional musician, studying classical composition at a respected university. But life had other plans. His family lost their money in a business failure. He had to quit school and find work. Eventually, he immigrated to America, hoping for a fresh start. But by then, he was in his 30s with no degree and limited English. Music became a memory, something beautiful he had left behind. "I'm not telling you this for pity," Thomas said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm telling you because I see myself in you. That hunger, that need to play even when the world tells you that you don't belong. Don't ever lose that." Daniel felt tears pressing behind his eyes. "The maestro hates me. He thinks I'm not good enough because I'm poor, because I didn't grow up in the right neighborhood or go to the right preparatory schools." "The maestro is a brilliant musician," Thomas said carefully, "but he's also a man who has forgotten something important. He's forgotten that music doesn't come from money or status. It comes from here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "And from here," he tapped his temple. "You have both. I hear it every morning when you play." From that day forward, Thomas became Daniel's silent ally. He would arrive early to unlock the auditorium, sometimes sitting in the back to listen, sometimes just cleaning quietly while Daniel practiced. He never offered advice about the music itself. He said he wasn't qualified for that. But his presence was encouraging, a reminder that someone believed in what Daniel was doing. Meanwhile, during regular hours, Christopher was becoming a problem in a different way. The principal pianist was talented, everyone acknowledged that. But he was also lazy, because things had always come easily to him, because his last name opened doors and his family's money smoothed every rough path. He had never learned to truly work hard. He showed up to rehearsals late. He made mistakes and laughed them off. He sometimes skipped practice sessions entirely to go sailing with his friends or attend parties at expensive restaurants. The maestro noticed, but said nothing. Christopher's father was a major donor to the conservatory. Criticizing the son might offend the father, and that could mean losing funding. So the maestro made excuses, blamed the orchestra for not following Christopher's tempo, insisted that small errors didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But some people noticed. A violinist named Iris Park, who served as the concertmaster and led the string section, started watching Daniel during rehearsals. She had seen him in the building at odd hours, always carrying his worn backpack, always moving with purpose. She had heard rumors that someone was practicing in the auditorium before dawn, and she had noticed how Daniel's eyes never left the piano during rehearsals, how his fingers moved slightly against his knees, silently playing along with every note Christopher performed. One afternoon, after a particularly sloppy rehearsal where Christopher had fumbled the same passage 3 times without seeming to care, Iris approached Daniel in the hallway. She was a serious young woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried her violin case like it was made of gold. "You're the scholarship student," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniel replied, expecting another dismissal. "I hear you're getting up at 5 in the morning to practice," she continued. "That takes dedication." Daniel felt his face grow hot. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me. I just pay attention." She studied him for a moment. "The international competition is in 3 weeks. Between you and me, I'm worried. Christopher isn't taking this seriously, and the maestro won't push him because of who his family is. This is the biggest performance of the year, and we're going to embarrass ourselves if something doesn't change. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Iris shrugged. Because I believe in being prepared, and because I think the maestro is wrong about you. I've been playing violin since I was 4 years old. I know real dedication when I see it. She started to walk away, then paused and looked back. Keep practicing. You never know when your chance might come. That night, Daniel called his mother from the payphone outside the conservatory. His cell phone had been disconnected weeks ago when they couldn't afford the bill. She answered on the third ring, sounding tired. She worked 2 jobs, one at a grocery store during the day, another cleaning offices at night, trying to support Daniel and his 2 younger sisters. Baby, why are you calling so late? She asked. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Mom, he said, even though his voice shook a little. I just wanted to hear your voice. They talked for a few minutes about his sisters, about bills and groceries and the normal struggles of their life. Before hanging up, his mother said something that stayed with him. Your grandmother used to tell me that the best musicians aren't the ones with the most talent. They're the ones who refuse to give up. You've got that in you, baby. I see it every day. As Daniel walked back to his small apartment that night, the streets dark and mostly empty, he thought about everything. About Thomas and his lost dreams, about Iris and her warning, about his grandmother and her music, about his mother working herself to exhaustion to give him this chance. He thought about the Steinway piano waiting in the darkness, and about the music that lived inside him, demanding to be played. Tomorrow morning he would wake up at 5 o'clock again, and he would keep playing, keep improving, keep believing, because that was all he knew how to do. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the international competition. Daniel was in the library trying to study music theory while his stomach growled from skipping lunch to save money. His phone, he had managed to get it reconnected for the month, buzzed in his pocket. The number was unfamiliar. Hello? Daniel, this is Iris Park. You need to get to the conservatory right now. Something's happened. The urgency in her voice made his heart skip. He grabbed his backpack and ran the 6 blocks to the conservatory, arriving breathless and sweating. Students were clustered in small groups in the main hall, whispering urgently. Some looked shocked. Others seemed almost excited, like they were watching a drama unfold and couldn't wait to see what happened next. Daniel found Iris near the auditorium doors. Her face was pale, her violin case clutched tightly against her chest. What's going on? He asked. Christopher's hurt. Bad. The story came out in pieces from different people. Christopher had gone on a weekend ski trip to some expensive resort in the mountains with his friends. He was showing off, trying to impress a girl, taking risks on slopes he shouldn't have been on. He hit a patch of ice, lost control, and crashed into a tree. Both hands were injured. The right one had a severe fracture. He was in the hospital now, and the doctors said he wouldn't be able to play piano for at least 3 months, maybe longer. The maestro was in his office with the door closed. Through the frosted glass, Daniel could see his silhouette pacing back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried through the door, rising and falling in angry Italian. What's going to happen? Daniel asked quietly. Iris looked at him with eyes that held something between pity and determination. That's why I called you. The competition is in 2 days. We've been preparing for this for 6 months. The maestro will have to find a replacement pianist or we'll have to withdraw, and if we withdraw, it's a huge embarrassment. The conservatory's reputation takes a hit. The maestro's reputation takes a hit. Everyone loses. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. You think he'll ask me? I think he'd rather drink poison, Iris said bluntly. But unless he can find a professional pianist willing to learn our entire program in 48 hours, which is basically impossible, you're the only option. You're the understudy. That's literally what understudy means. You're supposed to step in when the main person can't perform. Over the next hour, the administrative staff made frantic calls. Could they postpone their slot at the competition? No, could they find another pianist from a different conservatory? No one was available or prepared. Could they simplify the program? Absolutely not. The pieces had already been submitted and approved. Each phone call ended in frustration. Finally, at nearly 6 o'clock in the evening, the maestro emerged from his office. His face looked like he had aged 10 years in a few hours. His carefully styled hair was messy from running his hands through it. His expensive suit was wrinkled. He walked to the center of the main hall where students had gathered, waiting for news. "We have a situation," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "As you all know, Christopher will not be able to perform. We have explored every alternative." He paused, and Daniel could see how much the next words cost him. "Our only option is to use our understudy pianist." All eyes turned to Daniel. Some students looked skeptical. Others looked concerned. A few looked like they were watching a train wreck about to happen. The maestro's gaze finally landed on Daniel, and the disgust in his eyes was barely concealed. "You will report for a full rehearsal tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. We have one chance to see if this will work. If you cannot perform at the required level, we will withdraw from the competition. Do you understand?" Daniel's voice came out stronger than he felt. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Don't embarrass us more than we're already embarrassed," the maestro said coldly. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in a circle of staring students. That night was the longest of Daniel's life. He barely slept, lying in his small bed in the apartment he shared with 2 other students, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced through every piece they would perform. He knew them all, had listened to every rehearsal, had practiced them in secret during his morning sessions, had studied the sheet music until he could see the notes in his dreams. But knowing the music and performing it in front of the maestro, the orchestra, and eventually hundreds of people at the competition were completely different things. Doubt crept in like cold water. What if he froze up? What if his fingers betrayed him? What if everyone was right and he really didn't belong in this world? He thought about calling his mother but decided against it. She had enough to worry about. Instead, he pulled out his grandmother's old sheet music and held it against his chest like a talisman. He could almost hear her voice. "Baby, when you're scared, that's when you need music the most. Music doesn't judge. Music just is." The next morning arrived gray and cold, with rain threatening in the heavy clouds. Daniel got to the conservatory an hour early. Thomas found him sitting alone in the auditorium, staring at the Steinway piano like it was a mountain he had to climb. "Big day," Thomas said, sitting down beside him. "I'm terrified," Daniel admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I prove everyone right that I don't belong here?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me tell you something I learned the hard way. The worst thing isn't failing. The worst thing is never trying because you're afraid of what other people think. I let fear stop me from chasing my music. I let other people's opinions become more important than my own dreams. Don't make my mistake, but what if—" "There's no what if," Thomas interrupted gently. "There's only what you do right now in this moment. You've been preparing for this every morning at 5 o'clock for weeks. You know this music. Now you just have to trust yourself." At 8 o'clock, the orchestra assembled. Students filed in, taking their seats, preparing their instruments. The energy in the room felt strange, part curiosity, part dread, part anticipation. Iris gave Daniel an encouraging nod from her position in the first violin section. The maestro entered last, walking slowly to his conductor's podium. He didn't look at Daniel. He simply raised his baton and said, "We'll start with the first movement. Try not to destroy it completely." Daniel sat at the piano bench, his hands shaking slightly. The keys felt cold under his fingers. Every eye in the room was on him. The maestro raised his baton higher, paused for a breath, and then brought it down. The orchestra began, and Daniel started to play. But something was wrong. His fingers felt clumsy, mechanical. He was playing the right notes, technically correct, but there was no life in them. He was so focused on not making mistakes, so conscious of all the judgment surrounding him, that the music became just a series of tasks to complete. Hit this key, then that one. Count the beats. Watch the maestro's baton. Don't mess up. Don't embarrass yourself. The maestro stopped conducting after just 2 minutes. The orchestra fell silent. "This is what I was afraid of," the maestro said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You play like a scared child, like someone who memorized movements but doesn't understand music. This is the international competition, not a practice room for amateurs." Daniel felt heat rush to his face. His throat tightened. Some students looked away, embarrassed for him. Others stared with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. They had known this would happen, had predicted this failure. "Again," the maestro commanded. "And this time, try to remember you're playing music, not just hitting keys in the correct order." They started again, and again. Daniel's playing was technically accurate but emotionally empty. He could feel himself shrinking, getting smaller and more uncertain with each passing measure. The maestro stopped them 3 more times, each interruption more cutting than the last. "We'll take a break," the maestro finally announced, his voice heavy with defeat. 15 minutes, though I don't know what difference it will make." As the orchestra members stood and stretched, chatting among themselves, Daniel remained at the piano, his head down, his hands trembling in his lap. He felt like crying but refused to give them that satisfaction. Then Iris was there standing beside the piano. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with those serious, intelligent eyes. "You're playing their way," she said quietly. "You're trying to be Christopher, trying to be what you think they want, but that's not who you are." "I don't know what you mean," Daniel said miserably. "Yes, you do. I've heard the rumors about someone practicing at dawn. I've seen the way your fingers move during rehearsals, like you're playing along in your head. You have your own voice, your own way of understanding this music. But you're so busy trying to fit into their mold that you've forgotten what makes you special." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "My parents came to this country with nothing. They were refugees who had to rebuild their entire lives. Everyone told them they didn't belong, that they should know their place. But my mother told me something I've never forgotten. The people who change the world are the ones who refuse to be what others expect them to be." Iris straightened up and adjusted her violin. "Stop playing like you're apologizing for being here. Stop playing like you're grateful they're giving you a chance. Play like you know you belong. Because you do." She walked back to her seat, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. The maestro returned, checking his watch impatiently. "Let's try once more. Though I'm beginning to think withdrawal might be our best option." Daniel took a deep breath. He thought about his grandmother, about Thomas, about his mother working 2 jobs. He thought about all the early mornings, all the secret practice sessions, all the music that lived inside him. And then he remembered his grandmother's last piece of advice, the one he had been too afraid to follow. "When you play, close your eyes and let the music see for you." The maestro raised his baton. The orchestra prepared, and as the moment came for Daniel to begin, he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He closed his eyes. When Daniel closed his eyes, the world didn't disappear. It transformed. The auditorium with its judging faces faded away. The maestro's disapproval became distant, like a voice calling from another room. Even his own fear, which had been crushing his chest like a weight, loosened its grip. In the darkness behind his closed eyelids, there was only the music waiting to be born. The maestro's baton came down. The orchestra began, and Daniel's fingers found the keys. What happened next was something nobody in that room had expected. The notes that came from the Steinway weren't just technically correct anymore. They were alive. Daniel's hands moved across the keyboard with a fluidity that seemed almost impossible, like water flowing over stones, like wind moving through trees. His left hand laid down a foundation of deep, rich chords while his right hand danced above, spinning melodies that wove in and out of the orchestra's sound. But it wasn't just the technical skill that stunned everyone. It was the feeling. Daniel wasn't playing the music the way it was written on the page, exactly as Christopher would have played it. He was interpreting it, adding his own voice to the conversation. When the piece called for sadness, his playing ached with a pain that he real and earned. When it called for joy, his notes sparkled with genuine happiness. And in the quiet moments, his piano whispered secrets that made people lean forward in their seats to hear. The maestro's baton, which had been moving with its usual strict precision, began to change. His movements became more fluid, more expressive. He found himself following Daniel's lead in ways he never did with Christopher, responding to the subtle push and pull of the pianist's interpretation. The orchestra felt it too. The violin player's bows moved with more passion. The cellist swayed as they played. Even the brass section, usually so focused on just hitting the right notes at the right volume, seemed touched by something they couldn't quite name. Iris played with tears streaming down her face, though she didn't know why she was crying. It was just that the music felt so honest, so completely without pretense, that it cracked something open inside her chest. Daniel played with his eyes closed the entire time. He could feel the music through his whole body, in his fingers, in his arms, in his breathing, in his heartbeat. He wasn't thinking about finger positions or tempo markings or what anyone thought of him. He was simply letting the music flow through him the way it had during all those secret morning practice sessions, when he had been alone with the piano and his grandmother's memory. The first movement ended. There should have been a brief pause, a moment for the maestro to prepare the orchestra for the next section. But nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence in the auditorium was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop 3 rooms away. Then, slowly, Daniel opened his eyes. What he saw confused him at first. The maestro was staring at him with an expression Daniel couldn't read. Iris had her hand over her mouth. Other orchestra members sat frozen, instruments held in midair. Some were crying. Others looked like they had just witnessed something they didn't have words for. Did I do something wrong? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The maestro lowered his baton slowly. His hand was shaking slightly. When he spoke, his voice was different than Daniel had ever heard it. Softer, with the edge of anger gone. Where did you learn to play like that? Daniel didn't know how to answer. I just played, the way my grandmother taught me. The way I practice in the mornings. In the mornings? The maestro's eyes narrowed. What mornings? Before Daniel could answer, Thomas stepped out from the back of the auditorium where he had been watching from the shadows. That would be my fault, maestro. I've been letting him into the auditorium early to practice. 5 o'clock every morning for the past few weeks. The maestro turned to look at Thomas. For a moment, Daniel thought there would be an explosion of anger, but instead the maestro just nodded slowly, like a man putting together pieces of a puzzle he should have seen earlier. 5 in the morning, the maestro repeated. While the rest of us slept, you were here playing my piano. I'm sorry, Daniel started to say, but the maestro held up his hand. Don't apologize. I'm the one who should apologize. The words seemed to cost him something like pulling teeth. I judged you before I heard you play. I saw where you came from, saw your clothes and your old backpack, and I decided you weren't worthy of my time or my piano. That was wrong of me. The maestro walked to the edge of the stage and sat down heavily, suddenly looking very tired. I've been teaching for 30 years. I've worked with some of the most talented young musicians in the world. But somewhere along the way I forgot something important. I forgot that music isn't about money or connections or the right family name. It's about this. He tapped his chest. Heart, soul, the willingness to pour yourself into the sound until there's nothing left. He looked up at Daniel. You have that. I heard it just now. Everyone in this room heard it. You didn't just play the notes. You made them mean something. Daniel felt something breaking loose inside him like ice cracking in spring. Does that mean, can we still go to the competition? The maestro stood up, and for the first time since Daniel had met him, there was a hint of a smile on his face. Can we go? Young man, after what I just heard, we have to go. We'd be cheating the world if we didn't let them hear you play. He turned to the orchestra. We'll take a 30-minute break. Then we run through the entire program one more time. And this time I want everyone to follow Daniel's lead. He's showing us how this music should really feel. As the orchestra members stood and began chatting excitedly, several of them came up to Daniel. The oboe player shook his hand. The trumpet player patted his shoulder. Even the students who had whispered and laughed when the maestro first humiliated him now looked at him with something approaching respect. Iris was the last to approach. She didn't say anything, just pulled him into a quick, fierce hug. I told you, she whispered in his ear. I told you to stop apologizing and start believing. During the break, Daniel found a quiet corner and called his mother. His hands were still shaking from adrenaline. She answered on the second ring. Baby? What's wrong? You never call during the day. Nothing's wrong, Mom. Everything's actually good. His voice cracked. Really good. He told her the story. About Christopher's accident, about his terrible first attempt at rehearsal, about closing his eyes and finally playing the way his grandmother had taught him, about the maestro's apology, about getting a second chance. His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Your grandmother is smiling right now. I know she is. She always knew you had this in you. She told me the night before she died, she said, That boy has music in his bones. One day the whole world is going to hear it. Daniel wiped his eyes. I wish she could be here. She is here, baby. Every time you sit at that piano, she's right there with you. After the break, they ran through the entire competition program. 2 hours of complex, demanding music that required perfect coordination between Daniel and the orchestra. And this time, with his confidence restored and his fear pushed aside, Daniel played like he had been born for this moment. The maestro conducted with an energy and passion that surprised even the veteran orchestra members. He gave Daniel freedom to interpret, to add his own voice, to make the music breathe and live. When they finished the final piece, the maestro set down his baton and addressed everyone. Tomorrow is the international competition. We will be performing in front of critics, musicians, and audiences from around the world. Some of these people will be expecting us to fail because of Christopher's accident. They'll be watching for mistakes, waiting for us to embarrass ourselves. He paused and looked directly at Daniel. Let's prove them all wrong. That evening, Daniel couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement, from anticipation, from the strange and wonderful feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. He pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo he had of his grandmother. She was sitting at her old upright piano, her hands resting on the yellowed keys, smiling at the camera with that warm, knowing look she always had. The piano was broken and battered, missing keys and covered in scratches. But in the photo it looked beautiful because of who was playing it. Daniel saved the image as his phone's background. Tomorrow he would walk onto one of the biggest stages of his life. Tomorrow he would sit at a $300,000 piano in front of hundreds of people. Tomorrow he would prove that talent wasn't about where you came from or how much money you had. Tomorrow, he would show the world what his grandmother had always known. That music, real music, came from the heart, and his heart was full of songs waiting to be played. He set his alarm for 7 o'clock for once. He would get a full night's sleep, and closed his eyes with a smile on his face. The Steinway piano was waiting. The stage was waiting. The world was waiting. And finally, Daniel Hayes was ready. The morning of the competition arrived with pale winter sunlight streaming through Daniel's window. He woke up feeling strangely calm, like the nervous energy had burned itself out and left behind something steady and solid. He put on the only suit he owned, bought secondhand from a thrift store, a little too big in the shoulders but clean and pressed. His mother had insisted he keep one nice outfit for important occasions. She must have known somehow that this day would come. The competition was being held at the Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall, a building that looked like a palace from the outside with its white columns and gold-trimmed doors. Inside, the lobby was filled with musicians from conservatories around the world. Daniel heard conversations in French, German, Mandarin, Spanish. Everyone looked polished and confident, like they belonged in spaces this grand. The Riverside Conservatory Orchestra gathered in their assigned rehearsal room backstage. The maestro went over last-minute details, but his usual sharpness was softened by something new. Encouragement, maybe even hope. When he looked at Daniel, there was no more disgust in his eyes, just expectation. Remember, the maestro said to everyone, we performed last today. That means we have the advantage of closing the competition, but it also means we have to wait, stay focused, stay warm, and trust each other. They could hear other orchestras performing throughout the morning and afternoon. Some were brilliant, some were merely good. Each performance was followed by polite applause from the audience. Daniel tried not to listen too closely, tried not to let the competition psyche him out. But it was hard not to feel the weight of what they were about to do. Backstage, in the quiet moments between other performances, something unexpected happened. Christopher showed up. His right hand was wrapped in a thick bandage and a brace. His usually perfect hair was messy, and he looked smaller somehow, less sure of himself. He found Daniel sitting alone in a corner, going over the sheet music one last time even though he had it memorized. Hey, Christopher said quietly. Daniel looked up, surprised. They had barely spoken in all the months at the conservatory. I heard what happened at rehearsal yesterday, Christopher continued. He shifted his weight awkwardly from foot to foot. Everyone's talking about how you played, how the maestro actually apologized to you. Yeah, Daniel said, not sure where this was going. Christopher sat down on a chair across from him. I need to say something, and I need to say it before you go out there. I've been a jerk to you. Actually, worse than a jerk. I've ignored you, looked down on you, treated you like you didn't matter. And I did it because—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Because I was jealous." "Jealous?" Daniel couldn't hide his surprise. "Of me?" "Of your hunger," Christopher said. "Of the way you actually care about music. I've had everything handed to me my whole life. The best teachers, the best instruments, the best opportunities. But I never had to fight for any of it, so I never learned to appreciate it. You fight for every single note. You practice at 5 in the morning while I'm sleeping off hangovers. You actually love this, and I just do it because it's what's expected." He looked down at his injured hand. "Maybe breaking my hand was the universe telling me something. Maybe I needed to step aside so someone who actually deserves this chance could have it." He stood up and extended his left hand. "Good luck out there. And I mean that. Really." Daniel shook his hand, too moved to speak. Finally, after what felt like forever, it was their turn. An announcer stepped onto the stage and spoke into a microphone. "Our final performance of the day comes from the Riverside Music Conservatory, conducted by the renowned maestro Antonio Ricci." The orchestra filed onto the stage, and Daniel walked to the piano. The concert hall was enormous, with 3 levels of seats rising up into shadows. Every seat was filled, hundreds of faces, maybe 1,000, all watching. In the front rows, Daniel could see the judges, famous musicians and critics with clipboards and stern expressions. Somewhere in the middle section, he spotted Thomas, who had taken the afternoon off work to be here. And near the back, struggling to see over taller people, was his mother with his 2 little sisters. His mother was wearing her best dress, the one she saved for church, and she was crying before the music even started. The stage lights were hot and bright. Daniel sat at the piano, not the Steinway from the conservatory, but an even more magnificent instrument, a concert grand that gleamed under the lights like liquid midnight. He adjusted the bench, placed his hands in his lap, and waited. The maestro walked to his podium. The audience fell completely silent. Somewhere in the distance, Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. Then the maestro raised his baton and time seemed to slow down. Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't close them because he was scared. He closed them because this was how he played. This was how his grandmother had taught him. Eyes closed, heart open, letting the music see for him. The baton came down. The orchestra breathed in together, and Daniel began to play. The first notes floated out into the vast concert hall like birds taking flight. His fingers moved across the keys with a confidence that came from somewhere beyond technique, beyond training. It came from all those mornings at 5 a.m., from his grandmother's broken keyboard, from his mother's sacrifices, from every moment of doubt and every small victory. As the music built, something magical happened. The orchestra and the piano weren't just playing together, they were having a conversation. The violins would ask a question, and Daniel's right hand would answer. The cellos would offer a statement, and his left hand would support and expand it. The maestro conducted with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. In the middle section, there was a solo passage where the orchestra fell away and left Daniel alone with the piano. This was the moment he had been most nervous about. The exposed section where there was nowhere to hide, but with his eyes closed, he wasn't afraid. His hands danced across the keys, spinning out a melody that started soft and built to something powerful, something that spoke of struggle and hope and the refusal to give up. The audience forgot they were supposed to be critically judging. They forgot to take notes or check their programs. They simply listened, caught up in the story the music was telling. Daniel played like he was channeling something larger than himself, like his grandmother was guiding his hands, like every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been called poor guy and dismissed, was playing through him. The music swelled and whispered, thundered and caressed. It was technically perfect, but more than that, it was alive. When the final chord came, Daniel held it, letting it ring out into the enormous space, letting it fade naturally rather than cutting it off. The orchestra held their instruments still. The maestro held his baton raised. Nobody moved. Then silence. Complete, total silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. Daniel opened his eyes and saw 1,000 faces staring at him. For one terrible moment he thought he had done something wrong, that the silence meant he had failed. Then the applause started. It began with one person standing in the back, then two, then a section, then a wave rising up through the entire concert hall. Within seconds, everyone was on their feet. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming, mixed with shouts of "Bravo!" in multiple languages. People were throwing flowers onto the stage. The judges themselves were standing and clapping, their critical expressions replaced by something like wonder. Daniel stood from the piano bench, overwhelmed. The orchestra members were hugging each other, laughing and crying at the same time. Iris grabbed his hand and pulled him forward to take a bow. The maestro came over and embraced him, whispering, "Thank you," in his ear, though Daniel wasn't sure what exactly he was being thanked for. The applause went on for 5 full minutes. 5 minutes of standing ovation from an audience that had seen dozens of performances that day. 5 minutes that felt like a lifetime and a heartbeat all at once. In the audience, Daniel's mother was sobbing into her hands while his sisters jumped up and down with excitement. Thomas was clapping so hard his hands hurt, a huge smile on his face. Even Christopher, watching from the wings with his injured hand, was applauding with his good hand against his leg. Later, when they announced the winners, nobody was surprised when Riverside Conservatory took first place. The judges said things like transcendent and once in a generation, and reminded us why we love music. But Daniel barely heard the praise. He was still floating in that space where the music had taken him, still feeling his grandmother's presence, still amazed that any of this was real. After the ceremony, scholarships were offered from prestigious institutions around the world. Famous musicians asked for his contact information. A recording company representative wanted to discuss opportunities. It was dizzying and overwhelming and wonderful. But the moment Daniel treasured most came when his mother finally made her way backstage through the crowds. She didn't say anything, just pulled him into a hug that said everything words couldn't. His sisters jumped around them, asking 100 questions about the piano and the stage and everything. Grandma would be so proud. His mother whispered. "She was here," Daniel said. "I felt her, the whole time." Months later, after the dust settled and life found a new normal, Daniel made a decision. Yes, he accepted opportunities to study with renowned teachers and perform at prestigious venues. But he also did something else. He returned to his old neighborhood and arranged to donate pianos to the community center. Not fancy concert grands, just solid working instruments that kids could learn on. And every Saturday, he taught free lessons to anyone who wanted to learn. Kids who couldn't afford expensive conservatories. Kids who reminded him of himself. On the first day of these lessons, a shy girl about 10 years old approached the piano nervously. She was wearing clothes that had been patched and mended multiple times. "I don't know if I'm good enough for lessons," she said quietly. Daniel smiled and thought of the maestro's words that first day. "Don't touch my piano, poor guy." "Come sit down," he told her gently. "The piano doesn't care where you come from or what you're wearing. It only cares about what's in your heart. Now let me teach you something my grandmother taught me. When you play, close your eyes and let the music see for you." The girl sat at the piano, placed her small hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. And somewhere in the space between notes and silence, between dreams and reality, Daniel's grandmother smiled. The music played on,